In this video, I am going to show you exactly what it's like to take the ADHD exam. This one's for all of the adults watching this right now who suspected from an early age, hey, there's something going on with me. Maybe I have trouble focusing. Maybe I am a little bit jumpy. For whatever reason, our parents just didn't take us to a doctor to be seen. Some of us went on to adulthood and had successful jobs and successful relationships, didn't have any problems, but there were a few of us that went on and for whatever reason just couldn't make it work, just struggled with that job, struggled with relationships, struggled with day-to-day tasks. This video is for you. I knew I had an opportunity here. I had already been through the ADHD exam once in the beginning of 2020. This was my second test. I knew if I could take diligent notes, I could share them with the world, so that's what I did. I'm going to take you step by step through the ADHD exam and show you what it's like to take the exam as an adult. You can trust me, this information is as accurate as possible. I bought a lab coat specifically for this video. Also, I've got the nerdy glasses and I have a clipboard. What's not to trust about this? Okay, let's start with the why. Why would you seek out testing in the first place? Well, I happen to go through this same process, and I'm going to tell you my story. Let's go back a ways to when I was maybe 10 years old or so. I know I was struggling in school. I actually got held back a grade, but for whatever reason, my parents didn't really follow through and get me the professional help I think I needed. Of course, back then there wasn't the support that kids have now. This was the 80s, and I think the mentality was, no, your kid doesn't need help. They just need to apply themselves a little bit better. Nowadays, we know that's wrong. We know that kids actually need intervention early on. They're going to be way more successful in school. They're going to be way more successful in their relationships and peer interactions if they get the help early on. So I went through quite a few years of struggling with school. I was actually fairly good at test taking, at least enough to get by without failing classes. I did have a few teacher interventions along the way. They talked to my parents talked to me. They said, apply yourself harder. This was the cycle throughout those years. Right around the end of the 90s was where people started taking it seriously. People started referring kids out to get help. Of course, you've got the other side of that coin where a lot of parents objected to that. I think there's a huge stigma out there. A lot of parents back then didn't want their kids to be labeled. A lot of parents believed that their kids were perfect, they didn't need help, and they could get by on their own. We know that's wrong right now, but this was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, something like that. Let's jump ahead to 2020. I've already been through several jobs. I can't stick to one particular job for very long because my mind just gets worn out. I remember one job in particular. I was working at a bank. This job required very intense concentration. I needed to keep track of money. I needed to keep track of where it was going. And it was fairly high stakes in that I couldn't screw up. And I remember going home specifically on those days, like a Friday night, everyone's coming in with their paychecks, and after a while I felt like I couldn't do it. I felt like all the numbers were just slowing me down. The pace of the job really wasn't forgiving, and so I had a lot of errors that I had to explain and stay hours after work just trying to figure out what I did wrong. After so many of those days, I just couldn't take the pressure and I left. I got a new job. It was an office job. I felt comfortable, I felt supported, but there was still this problem where I could only do so much work before my brain just shut down. I had trouble focusing, I had trouble organizing my work, I had piles of paperwork everywhere. I knew at some point I was going to have to deal with it, but the mental and physical clutter just piled up on me, and it got to the point where I was really sluggish and took forever just getting basic tasks done. Then in 2020, I got what I thought was a breakthrough. I was finally taken seriously by a therapist. I said, enough is enough, I need to get help for this. I got a referral for ADHD testing. That was in January going into February of 2020. We know what happened back then. They got most of the testing done. It was time to analyze the results, and I got an appointment to come in and go over the results in March of 2020. Obviously, things took a turn for the worse in March. Before I knew it, my appointment was canceled, and I had to go begging for my results. Turns out the doctor who had so graciously agreed to take on my case actually got furloughed because of the pandemic. I was back to square one. I didn't know what to do. I struggled. This was a mental health clinic. I went back and I begged them to dig up the results, to find that old doctor and figure out my testing results. It took me about 8 months or so to actually get anyone to talk to me. In the end, I had an appointment to go over the test. They didn't even have my records in front of them. They just wanted to get rid of me. This was heartbreaking. This was devastating when I thought I finally had something figured out. So I went on for several more months through the pandemic, thinking I had undiagnosed ADHD, but didn't know what to do about it. Obviously, everyone started working from home. The distractions piled up. In a way, it was a little easier working from home because I could deal with all the different stimulus coming in from everywhere. As the pandemic wore on, it got harder and harder to focus. I ended up getting a new job. I thought, this is great. This is the right job for me. I was still working from home, but the same problems kept on happening over and over again. The lack of focus, the distractions, the need to get up out of my seat and do something else for a while. I thought, this is ridiculous. At some point in the middle of 2021, I had had enough with my old mental health clinic and I quit them. I went without therapy for a little bit until I ended up finding the perfect therapist for me. Someone in a private practice who took me seriously, who was willing to listen to my symptoms and my complaints and actually get me referred out for testing. Now, here's the first thing to look out for that I had to deal with. Testing as an adult, at least in the US, we're familiar with the insurance system here. We don't have the greatest system in the world. Basic stuff like this, quality of life issues like ADHD screening, wasn't covered for me in my insurance. It was partially covered, but I had to pay a big chunk of money just to make sure it happened. $550 with my insurance. This was a tough pill to swallow, and I knew I needed to pay that money just to get the results, just to get the help that I needed. So I bit the bullet and paid the $550. So why would you want to seek out an ADHD diagnosis in your adulthood? Well, the biggest thing is you've got undiagnosed symptoms going on, specifically having to do with inattention or hyperactivity. Obviously, these things change from childhood. You probably had some symptoms early on, and they manifest a little bit differently as you get older. So you're not jumping off the walls. You're not getting out of your seat when you're told not to. Obviously, you don't have a teacher telling your parents that you're running around during class, but maybe you can't sit still at your desk while at work. These things present a little bit differently when you get older, but they're the same principles that I'm going to list here right now. These are the basic criteria that they use to come up with an initial diagnosis, or at least a case for getting diagnosed. ADHD, as you may know, stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and it presents in two different categories of behavior. The inattentive part is you make careless mistakes, you may lack attention to detail, you might have difficulty sustaining attention, you might not appear to listen to or follow instructions well, you might have difficulty organizing yourself in adulthood. That might present as clutter on your desk for work, or the inability to keep a calendar and keep track of appointments. You might avoid activities requiring sustained mental effort. You might lose things easily, and you might be forgetful during daily activities. Now, the H part of ADHD is the hyperactivity. This is the one that I feel presents a lot differently in adulthood versus childhood. Some of the universal signs that they ask about are fidgeting with hands or feet, or squirming in your chair. You might have difficulty remaining seated, extremely restless, difficulty engaging in quiet activities. You might act as if you're driven by a motor. You might talk excessively, blurt out answers before questions have been completed. You might have difficulty waiting or taking turns, and you might interrupt or intrude on others' conversations. Now, obviously, we're going to have to take some liberties when we translate these symptoms into adulthood. Like I said, the squirming in the chair could be at work or at home instead of at school. A lot of adults I know don't have to wait their turn for certain things like they did when they were 10 years old. But it might be something as simple as completely disregarding a line at a bank and going straight up to the teller when there's a few people waiting already in line. Use your judgment about these things. Obviously, you can go through these signs and say, yes, I have a dozen of these signs. I should probably get help. Self-diagnosis is a slippery slope. You really don't want to go through life and say, yes, I have ADHD without getting the proper supports from professionals, whether it be medication or therapy tools, that sort of thing. This is really the first step. The next logical step is getting the exam, but knowing yourself is critically important and being able to say, yes, I struggle with these things. Before you go into the test, they're going to have you fill out some questionnaires. You're going to get a questionnaire about your own behavior history, and you'll likely get a partner or a family member survey to hand off to somebody close to you who observes your daily routines, who knows your behavior and sees when you're squirming in your seat while you're watching a movie, or says, yes, they interrupt me all the time when we're having a conversation. You fill out your part, your partner or family member, close friend, roommate, they fill out the other survey, both get sent in ahead of time. One disclaimer about what I'm about to tell you. This is not a question for question guide that you study from. You should go into this test prepared mentally, but not necessarily knowing all the answers. That would actually hurt your diagnosis. You're going to want to go in and answer these questions as if this is your first time. I'm giving you this information to prepare you so you know what to expect, but not something to study from, because that could really hurt your diagnosis. Now, when you get into the testing room, you're going to be presented with, a dozen or so different mini tests. Prepare to sit there for a little while, and that is a little bit deliberate. They're going to want to observe you as you go on through the test. Obviously, this is kind of a difficult exercise. They want to see how you sit and behave over the course of an hour or so. Are you going to fidget? That sort of thing. That's all okay. The next step in the exam is a vocabulary section. They're going to want to go over a set of words, very basic to start out from, and they're going to ask you for definitions. For example, they're going to ask you to define the word shirt. Obviously, it's a piece of clothing that you wear on the top of your body. Great. These words are going to go from easy to slightly more difficult. Remember, these aren't exactly just measuring your intelligence, they're also measuring your ability to deal with questions over a long period of time. So some of these questions might seem really ridiculously stupid, and they are. That's not the point. Next, they're going to give you a list of words to read aloud. It's going to be a list of words on a paper. You go from easy to difficult, very simple. The next step is pattern recognition. You're going to do a series of exercises on a piece of paper. You'll get about 4 different choices. One of the options is missing, so you have to fill in the blanks. This video is difficult to make because of all the distractions. They're going to give you a set of patterns. They are usually shapes in a box. You're going to discern which option out of a multiple choice set of options is the correct one in the pattern. The next section was a fun one. It involved reading colors off of a page. This was a little bit unusual because you'd start out reading words like red, green, blue, yellow, and then they'd make it a little more interesting. They'd give you those same colors, red, blue, green, yellow, but the colors of the words would be different than the actual word. The next step was having you name the colors, not the words. The word red would be colored blue, so you'd have to read blue. You would go through several strings of this until your brain was feeling a little bit mushy after a while. That's normal. The next section is a number section. They start with repeat after me numbers. So the proctor of this exam would read off a string of single-digit numbers like 2, 3, 9, and you'd have to repeat it back. Then the proctor would read off numbers like 2, 3, 9, but you'd have to read them backwards, 9, 3, 2. Then the third section was the proctor would read off numbers 2, 4, 7, 3, and you'd have to read them back but in order. So 3, 4, 7, for example. This started with 2-digit numbers and worked its way up to about 8 or 9 digits. The next section was what I call a cipher. It's like a code. Basically, they match up symbols with numbers and they time you to see how long you can decode these symbols. After that was a very simple connect the dots. You'd start out by drawing a line without lifting your pen, connecting numbers in order. Really simple until they get to the next section where they use alternating numbers and letters. So you'd have to connect 1, A, 2, B, 3, C, and so on. The next big section in the test is counting dots as quickly as possible. This seems very basic, but they're going to time how long it takes you to count out dots on a piece of paper. At some point, the proctor of my exam broke in and took a little bit of a break and actually started asking me some more questions about my history, trying to build a rapport, trying to see how I answered her. A lot of those questions were again about my history going back to age 12 and prior, some behavior information, what I remember. She also started asking questions about my family and people close to me now. She wanted to gauge basically how I responded to her. Was I friendly? Was I limiting my words? Was I struggling after this series of questions? The next section was a test of attention. This was a recording on a computer that was being played back, and I had to give different information, different answers about sequences of numbers. So one question was, how many numbers are in the sequence F36, 5K7H? There were 10 trials in all. The only rule was I couldn't count sequences with my fingers. I had to mentally track these numbers in my head. They did the same thing with letters in sequence. I had to list how many letters were in the sequence in my head without counting on my fingers. There were 10 trials altogether in this unit. Last but not least was my absolute favorite part of the test. Not really. It was a computer exam and it flashed letters on the screen at varying intervals. And I had to hit the space bar on every letter that popped up on the screen except for X. At first this was fairly easy, but this part of the exam actually lasted about 14 or 15 minutes. And as it went on, my brain just started slowing down. I started hitting the space bar on X by accident. It was a mess. By the end of this, my brain was just slush. I couldn't really think. I was a mess. And that's the point of the exam. They want to see exactly how much of a mess you really are. Obviously, in real life scenarios, they can't stand over you while you're watching you work. They want to see how long it takes to impact your work. That was it for my exam. I had to then go out into the hallway and wait about 25 minutes or so for the doctor to decipher my results and go over my initial surveys again and put that all together into a diagnosis. This was a phenomenal practice. They really put everything together fairly quickly, and I was very impressed at how they did this. When I got called back into the room, this is when she sat me down and told me how I did on the test. I was a little nervous at this point because I still didn't know if I passed the test or not. And I was just sitting there, kind of a bundle of nerves, waiting to know, was I going to get my answer or not? But I sat down and discussed with her again exactly why I sought out a diagnosis for ADHD. She came out and acknowledged that it's tougher to diagnose in adulthood because so many of our indicators occur before the age of 12. So the system is really set up to work for kids. As adults, we really have to do a lot of going back in time and describing the onset of these symptoms. A lot of us struggle with remembering that far back, but the doctor is really going to help you try to pull those memories out and see exactly what happened back then. For me, Like I said, I got held back a grade and I had some teacher interventions with my progress. I had trouble staying in my seat and containing myself a lot in class, especially early on. I was able to present that information to her, and she used that to come up with a diagnosis. She told me that the cognitive portion of the test ruled out a learning disability. They are looking for that during the testing process, just to rule out that there might not be another issue. Now, when we get an ADHD diagnosis, there's going to be 4 major subtypes. There's inattentive, hyperactive, a combined, and then unspecified. Inattentive and hyperactive are just what they sound. Obviously, someone's going to have trouble with attention, or someone's just going to have trouble bouncing off the walls, staying in their seat, that sort of thing. The combined ended up being my diagnosis. That was when the attention is a struggle, and I also have trouble sitting still. I fidget a lot, that sort of thing. There's also the unspecified type, where ADHD is suspected by the professional, but you might not meet the exact criteria of a diagnosis, but you come close enough where the doctor's going to say, I still believe you have ADHD. That's really it for the exam. I should note that the first exam I took back in early 2020 was spread out a lot more over a few days. The exam that I got this year was really abbreviated. It was those 10 major units. They got it all done in about an hour and a half, 2 hours. So depending on who diagnoses you, you might have a different experience, either a fairly short test or a slightly longer test played out over a few different days. There are reasons behind these different versions of the test. Now, of course, the other route you could take is just going through your primary care doctor and saying, look, I struggle with attention. I'm still fidgety. I think I might have ADHD. When I took these results from my exam to my primary care doctor, he gave me his own exam, and it was literally 1 page long. And it was a very short version of the questionnaire that I got from the people who tested me. Ultimately, the diagnosis helped me in that I was able to access medication. My primary care doctor eventually got me on a dose of Adderall. I'm creating a separate video just to log exactly how Adderall affects me in the first couple of weeks, because I really want to track what combination of tools can help me along the way with my attention issues. So far, Adderall is the right answer for me, but there are several different medications that your doctor might want to prescribe. The exam was also helpful in that I could take the results back to my therapist, and my therapist could arm me with the tools that I need to help myself focus on top of the medication, so that I would have a much easier time getting through my workday, so that I would be able to focus on the tasks that I have in front of me, so that I'd know when to take breaks and I wouldn't be constantly checking out of work. It's really that combination of medicine and therapy tools that are really helping me right now. And I'm pleased to say that I'm about 2 weeks out of my exam and about 1 week out from getting Adderall, and I'm doing pretty great right now. So if you were on the fence about approaching your doctor or your therapist about getting the exam, I hope this video helps you. If nothing else, you might be at least a little bit more prepared about the process behind the ADHD exam, and you might get the confidence you need to go in and ask, is this right for me? For a lot of us, especially into adulthood, this has been a long process. You deserve to get answers. You deserve to get the tools you need to help you through life. ADHD, especially in adulthood, especially undiagnosed for so long, might make you feel like you're just crawling through mud trying to get basic tasks done. There is help, there is hope. Talk to your doctor, talk to your therapist, and see if the ADHD exam is right for you. I promise you, for me, it was worth it. This is Jay. I hope you liked this video. If this was helpful, please consider liking this, and please consider subscribing to my channel. I talk a lot more about mental health challenges and what I do and the practices I incorporate into my life, whether through creativity or hobbies or helping others that help my mental health along the way. I hope you stick around for more videos. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.